It took me 5 years to write it. It's available if you're interested in Hurlburt on the tables. I'm actually a lawyer and a writer. I've written 10 other books. And as a lawyer, was a litigator. I'm not currently practicing. So litigators always put their points right up on the first page. So that's how I'm doing it here. These are my points. Everyone knows that income taxes are onerous and unfair, but what can we do about it? We have to fund the government in some way. The obvious and easy solution is to let the government simply print the money, but the objection to that has always been that it would be inflationary. Price inflation results when demand or money increases faster than supply. But that is the secret. If you use the money that you add to the system by letting the government print it to create supply, like roads, bridges, things that are actually useful and marketable, and add to the gross domestic product, then you won't have inflation because supply and demand will go up together. So these are my points. Income taxes could be eliminated by the simple expedient of allowing Congress to issue the money it needs. This idea is not new. Government-created fiat money was the original brilliant invention of the American colonists. Bank-created credit displaced it historically by a series of deceptions. Government-created fiat money need not be inflationary. What is inflationary is the current system of bank-created credit. Ready credit has allowed the country to prosper and thrive for 300 years. It is time we eliminated the non-producing middlemen and created our own public credit system free of taxes or debt. The country was actually built on fiat money. Benjamin Franklin called it ready money. It's ready credit. He said in Poor Richard's Almanac, there are 3 faithful friends, an old wife, an old dog, and ready money. He also said, defining what he meant by ready money, paper currency secured against future tax revenues turns prosperity tomorrow into ready money today. In other words, you plan what you want to produce, you issue paper receipts for the work to have it done, and then so you monetize your future productivity with paper that you issue today. And that was how our whole country has prospered, actually for 300 years, even though it took the ruse of bank-created paper money to keep it going. But even now, what we've done around the world is pretended we had money that we didn't really have. I mean, banks have done that. They've pretended they were issuing money, and they've lent it to their affiliated corporations, which have then essentially bought up everything. But it's all done with credit, easy money that wasn't there until it was borrowed. The American paper money system originated in 1691 with the colony of Massachusetts. So it actually predated the alternative, the rival currency, which was the Bank of England's paper banknotes. In 1694, the Bank of England was founded, and it issued paper money privately. The bank was privately owned, and it issued paper money to the government. It lent it to the government at interest. But the catch was that this money was supposedly backed by gold. That's why private bankers were allowed to do it. But in fact, they lent 10 times or they could lend up to 10 times as much paper money as they actually had gold. They usually lent about 6 times as much. And this system went back to the goldsmiths, who had discovered that when people left their gold for safekeeping, that they could lend out banknotes that supposedly represented this gold, and they could lend out many more times the banknotes as they actually had gold, up 6 to 10 times. So we've had these 2 competing systems in our history for 300 years. One is bank-created paper money, or bank-created fiat money, and government-created fiat money. And the government-created fiat money is actually much better and less inflationary. We don't owe it back. We don't owe interest on it. Either one is creating money out of nothing. One is a ruse. The other is what we think we already have. Most people think that money is created by the government. It isn't. That's what we want, is money created by the government, and if it were created by the government, we could eliminate taxes altogether. Benjamin Franklin said that the revolution was actually fought over paper money, over the right to issue paper money, more than over a tea tax. He said the colonies would gladly have borne the little tax on tea and other matters had it not been the poverty caused by the bad influence of the English bankers on the Parliament, which has caused in the colonies hatred of England in the Revolutionary War. An English historian made this even more clear, John Twells. He wrote of the colonial script. It was the monetary system under which America's colonies flourished to such an extent that Edmund Burke was able to write about them. Nothing in the history of the world resembles their progress. It was a sound and beneficial system, and its effects led to the happiness of the people. In a bad hour, said Twells, the British Parliament took away from America its representative money, forbade any further issue of bills of credit, these bills ceasing to be legal tender, and ordered that all taxes should be paid in coins. Consider now the consequences. This restriction of the medium of exchange paralyzed all the industrial energies of the people. Ruin took place in these once flourishing colonies. Most rigorous distress visited every family and every business. Discontent became desperation and reached a point, to use the words of Dr. Johnson, when human nature rises up and asserts its rights. The reason that King George had forbade the issue of paper money in the colonies was that some of the colonies had issued it irresponsibly. Particularly the New England colonies were just issuing and issuing and paying for things, and they didn't have a way of bringing it back to the government, and so this was inflationary, and the merchants were complaining that their money was losing value, and so that's why King George did what he did. But Pennsylvania had the ideal system, the one that I think we should go back to, that it's never actually been tried since we've been a country, which is to have the government actually be the bank, or to have a national bank that is actually national, owned by the government. So the government bank created money and lent it to the farmers at 5% interest, which was a better rate than they could get from the British bankers. And they couldn't even get money from the British bankers because the gold just wasn't there. So in Pennsylvania, before that, it was nobody wanted to come there. The colony was doing very poorly, and then suddenly when they got this idea of creating their own bank that would issue money, lend it to the farmers, and then the loans would come back to the government, and to avoid this problem of issuing only the principal and not the interest, and therefore having to borrow more and more and more to pay the interest, they would spend some on the side for roads and bridges and things that the colony needed. So it would all come back to the government, principal and interest, so you would have a non-inflationary system. Say you created $105, you would lend $100, spend $5, and take $105 back in principal and interest. So you never have to inflate the system, and they never paid taxes for the entire time that system was in place, for all the way up until King George stopped the colonies from issuing their money. The problem, as Richard explained, was that the Continental collapsed during the Revolutionary War, but not for the reasons that people thought. But for that reason, fiat money got a bad name. And it was basically because the British had given it a bad name. But the framers of the Constitution were so afraid of paper money after that they couldn't agree on whether to put it in the Constitution or not. So they just left it out. They didn't say who had the power to create paper money. All they said was Congress shall have the power to coin money. And then they said no state shall coin money or emit bills of credit. It also, the Constitution still says no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debt, which obviously they don't do. So it's clear we have to amend the Constitution at least on that point. Then in the 10th Amendment, part of the Bill of Rights, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So the states apparently aren't allowed to emit bills of credit, though what that is not exactly clear. I think J.W. argues that it doesn't mean paper money. But anyway, but at least the people should be authorized under that provision to issue paper money. And so I think that now at last, 300 years later, we should step in and exercise our right to take back from the banks that creating a money and issue it as the people collectively. This, let's see if I have time. I'd like to read this. This is an excerpt. It's so moving. I don't even know if I can read this without crying. Every time I read it, it makes me cry. It's about the conditions under which the Constitution came to be, and it was so traumatic. And so you can understand the problem they had with the money issue. This is from the Constitution of the United States by James Beck, 1922. A year after the Articles of Confederation had been adopted, the war came to an end by a preliminary treaty on November 30th, 1782. Now follows the least known chapter in American history. It was a period of travail, of which the Constitution of the United States and the present American nation were born. Only the shreds and patches of authority were left. Gradually the Union fell apart. The Army, which previously to the termination of the war had dissolved by the hundreds, was now unpaid and in a state of revolt. Measure after measure was proposed in Congress to raise money to pay the interest on the bonded indebtedness, which was in arrears, and to provide funds for the most necessary expenses, but these failed. The government made a call upon the states to raise $8 million for the most vital needs, but only $400,000 was actually received. Then Congress asked the states to vest in it the power to levy a tax of 5% on imports, but after waiting 2 years for the action of the states, less than 9 concurred. The impotence of the new government, which was still sitting in Philadelphia, can be measured by the fact that on June 9, 1983, word came that 80 soldiers were on their way to Philadelphia to demand relief. They stacked their arms in front of the State House, where the Congress was then sitting, and refused to disband when requested by Colonel Alexander Hamilton, who would later become the Treasury Secretary, to do so. When Congress appealed to the government of Pennsylvania for protection, it was advised that the Pennsylvania militia was likewise insubordinate. The Congress then hastily fled by night and became a fugitive. The impotence of the Confederation can be measured by the fact that in the last 14 months of its existence, its receipts were less than $400,000, while the interest on the foreign debt alone was over $2.4 million, and the interest on the internal debt was fivefold greater. In March '83, an anonymous communication was sent to Washington's officers to meet in secret, possibly to overthrow the government. A copy fell into Washington's hands, and he himself directed the officers to assemble. He unexpectedly appeared at the meeting, and being no speaker, he had reduced his appeal to writing. As he adjusted his spectacles to read it, he pathetically said, "I have not only grown gray, but blind in your service." He then made a touching appeal to them not to increase by example the spreading spirit of revolt. The very sight of their old commander turned the hearts of the revolting element, and the officers remained loyal to their noble leader. Where the spirit of disaffection was thus found in high places, it naturally prevailed more widely among the masses, who had been driven to frenzy by their sufferings. This culminated in a revolt in Massachusetts under the leadership of an old soldier named Shays, and it spread with such rapidity that not only did 1/5 of the people join in attempting to overthrow the remnant of established authority in Massachusetts, but it rapidly spread to other states. The offices of government and the courthouses were seized, the collection of debts was forbidden, and private property was forcibly appropriated to meet the common needs. Well, it goes on. But they were under extreme duress, and they couldn't agree on whether to include this paper money, so they left it out. But you can see why Hamilton felt he needed to do something, so he resorted to this ruse that he's been criticized for ever since, where he set up the first U.S. bank as a private bank that was 80% privately owned, and it did the same thing that the Bank of England did, which was issue money, paper money, and lend it to the government. But it appeared to be sound money because it appeared to be backed by gold. So it was that same ruse that we've been doing for 200 years now, where banks are actually creating our entire money supply, and it merely looks like they're lending real money because it was at one time backed by gold, and now it's supposedly backed by government debt. Oops, did I? Okay, Jefferson himself criticized paper money at one time in 1798, but later he changed his mind and said that although we have so foolishly allowed the field of circulating medium to be filched from us by private individuals, I think we may recover it. The states should be asked to transfer the right of issuing paper money to Congress in perpetuity. And in 1815, he said, the Treasury, lacking confidence in the country, delivered itself bound hand and foot to bold and bankrupt adventurers and bankers pretending to have money, whom it could have crushed at any moment. That's the same thing that's been happening for 200 years. The bankers have pretended to have money, and they've issued it to us, and that's why we're in debt. Everyone's in debt. Every single country in the world is in debt. Who are they in debt to? Not to each other. They're in debt to the banks. At the same time that the Constitutional Congress is meeting, Amschel Rothschild, the head of the international banking cartel, if you will, international banking family alleged to own a large part of the world by now, said, let me issue and control a nation's currency, and I care not who makes its laws. And that's what they've been doing. They've been issuing the currency not just of our country, of every country, now that the central banking system has taken over everywhere, nearly everywhere. And the places that it hasn't taken over, we go to war with. For instance, Hitler didn't succumb, and we went to war with Hitler, we, meaning the English and the American banking system. Russia didn't succumb, and we had a Cold War with Russia, and China, of course, issued their own money, and they're another public enemy, or have been. Iran issues its own money and hasn't knuckled into the central banking system, and they're an enemy. North Korea, of course, all the ones that won't agree to be part of the central banking system.
Cuba.
Okay, Cuba, yeah. I'll skip over that. Okay, many authorities have said that banks create the money they lend. So I'll just quote one, which is the Chicago Federal Reserve itself in Modern Money Mechanics said, of course, banks do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes in exchange for credits to the borrower's transaction accounts. Loans, assets, and deposits, liabilities, both rise by the same amount. So the result is, this is our money supply, and this is the federal debt. They're about equivalent. This is M3 is up here. Now the only money that the government creates is right here. Coins is $1 billion out of all this. So it's about 1/1000th of the money supply, way down here. And all the way to here includes coins of Federal Reserve notes, which you can argue about whether the Federal Reserve is actually federal. But even leaving that out, all of this, the vast majority of the money supply comes from somewhere else. It definitely doesn't come from the government. So where does it come from? It must come from banks, which many authorities have attested it does. And the reason the federal debt has to be roughly equivalent, is that somebody has to continually be taking out debt that never gets paid back in order to have a money supply at all. Ordinary commercial loans are paid off all the time. So, in fact, one of these authorities said that. Oh, I missed that. Anyway, if you only had private debt, you wouldn't have a money supply, because every time a debt got paid off, you would liquidate that portion of the money supply. So the federal debt hasn't been paid off since Andrew Jackson, and you can see it's just steadily grown. So that's highly inflationary. Every time we borrow, we think that we're borrowing existing money, and so it's not inflationary, but it is inflationary because we borrow from banks that create it out of nothing, and we never pay it back. Obviously, it would be much better if we, instead of borrowing the money, we merely issued the money, as the Pennsylvania colonists did. And that brings us to how much money could we create without creating inflation. These are actually Richard's figures, although the chart was created by my mother's caregiver, who's 22 years old, from Peru. I thought it was brilliant, though. So 13 trillion is the amount of our gross domestic product. That's goods and services that we actually produce. Somebody has to buy that stuff. But the earning power of the people is only $10 trillion. That's this one. So where does the difference, the approximately $3 trillion difference come from? It comes from banks. It's borrowed from banks. And in fact, not even all of this is spent, because about 10% is invested, not spent on goods and services. So that leaves $3.77 trillion not covered by wages, salaries, income, or dividends, to buy our own products that we produce. So all of that money is created by banks in the form of loans. It's all borrowed. So if the government were to create the money instead, and if banks were not allowed to create money, so you'd have to do this gradually, of course, but if you switched over from bank-created money to government-created money, you have a potential there of $3.77 trillion that you could create without creating inflation, and that's like far more than you need to cover. You could replace income taxes, and you'd still have a lot of money left over for roads and bridges and health and all those things that we think we can't afford right now. And we could actually create even more than that. This is the potential gross domestic product at full employment, using the figures of John Williams in a very good website called Shadow Government Statistics. He shows that we're 12%, unemployment is actually at 12%. So if you were at full employment and all those people were producing, you would have $14.75 trillion worth of goods and services using 2006 figures. So that would be over $5 trillion that you could add to the system without creating inflation. All that money could and should be generated by the government. It could replace taxes. We actually have the potential for great abundance, and the fact that we're living in scarcity is the result of a fraudulent system imposed by bank-created money. Okay. Yeah.
Libertarians have always been a tiny minority, and they were a tiny minority at the time of the formation of the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. We live in a society in which we get brainwashed with all sorts of documents like the Federalist Papers, and almost no one was given very much opportunity to learn the content of the anti-Federalist Papers. The Libertarians in recent years have stimulated the reading of those anti-Federalist Papers, and I have had the doctrine that if there had been anywhere near as many people in the period prior to between 1787 and the time of the 1800 when it really got started, that the Constitution would have probably been rejected rather than adopted. There were a bunch of wealthy scoundrels who were really dominating almost all of the formation of the Constitution. All of the gatherings were scheduled when it would be almost impossible for the ordinary farmer to get to it, but where it was plausible for the wealthy aristocrats to go. Mm-hmm. There were all sorts of speculation in regard to the continental currency and the amount of money that was made because the U.S. Constitution essentially adopted that continental debt, meant that there was tremendous profit by the people who were promoting the Constitution. Mm-hmm. You were talking about how government debt is usually not repaid. I remind people that England borrowed some money to pay for the fighting of the French and Indian War when George Washington was a officer for the British, and that they still are reissuing those bonds rather than paying. almost all government debt is eventually repudiated, as we have seen in our own lifetime of certain currencies going bad. We were able to essentially defeat Russia by manipulation of the value of the ruble, and other countries that want to attack U.S. are much more likely to do so by manipulation of the value of the dollar than by military attack. So we have a very, very much more complex global monetary system than we sometimes recognize. And though you are a great enthusiast for the greenbacks, I will be one who will be a very great enthusiast for somehow or other making the distinction not between different kinds of government-issued money, but contending that we want to get as close to a barter system as we can. And the function of money primarily is that of simplifying the need for barter by having some kind of standard of value. And Borsodi was among the economists who helped to establish that a dynamic basket of commodities, in other words, whatever are really the most used commodities, and you go back 10 years, you can have a standard of value that is almost without significant variation through the centuries, notwithstanding all sorts of variations in prices. Governments can do a lot of regulating, they need to, but they never have had any success in regulating rents or anything else that has a propensity for price fluctuation. So having the government accept price fluctuations, but recognizing that the people benefit from a stable standard of value is among the problems that we have to deal with. And I don't know all the answers. It's very complex, and whatever I might talk about, I know there'd be unforeseen consequences if it were adopted. But I do contend that
some other questions.
dynamic basket of commodities
Okay, I agree.
is a privatized
I agree with that.
monetary system that gets away from all of these problems of letting the government be very much involved on in any way on money.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask you just a quick question first? In your opinion, is the Federal Reserve an illegal entity under our Constitution and with regard to how it was created?
Well, it hasn't actually operated according to rules.
But its creation, you know,
there is a constitutional argument that Congress has no right to delegate its own responsibilities. There is an argument that the Federal Reserve per se is illegal. Constitutional argument.
Okay. Have they gotten so good at tweaking their own system that they could prevent a depression? I mean, are all the bankers in on this, other than like China, India, Russia? Is this system so well perfected? This is my question. That they can either prevent the collapse, or do you think the collapse is inevitable because
No,
it's getting away from them?
they can prevent themselves from going bankrupt, which is what they're doing right now by bailing themselves out by having the Federal Reserve monetize really bad security, which is that alone is not in compliance with the Federal Reserve Act. But the Titanic is going down, and they're just saving themselves. I assume they're off to Argentina or somewhere else.
So you're predicting a depression.
Yeah.
I would
Unless we change the system. I think we could change the system and we could save it all. That's why I bothered to argue.
I'd like to point out that if you are a careful student of history, you will notice that there's cycles of war, inflation, and depression, and the rich have instigated these and profited from them because they know how. And one of the speakers at the morning session on economic democracy suggested that the government buy out all the corporate stock at the bottom of this next depression so that we take it away from the capitalists. So I cornered him after the session. I said, well, that's such a great idea. That's why the rich are doing it. They harbor their resources, and when the prices go down, they fly. And so yes, we're going to have a depression, then we're going to have them adding to their wealth, then we're going to have inflation, then we're going to
My
have a war
proposed
stimulating
solution
inflation.
would be they want to be bailed out. I mean, those big banks, J.P. Morgan and Citibank, are definitely bankrupt because they're the biggest issuers of derivatives, and the whole derivative structure is collapsing in on itself. So they're concealing the fact that they're bankrupt by Enron-style creative accounting. And in fact, I just wrote an article on the fact that Bear Stearns was actually more solvent than J.P. Morgan said it was. Yeah, and that J.P. Morgan itself brought them down by naked short selling. In fact, naked short selling is rampant throughout the market right now, so rampant that nobody can expose it because it would collapse the whole stock market. Nobody would invest in the stock market if they knew how absolutely shaky every single stock is, or potentially open to manipulation every single stock is. So anyway, what you could do is what Congress should do, I think, is to have the FDIC do an audit of these big banks, and a careful audit, and establish whether or not they're actually solvent. If they're not solvent, the law is they should be put in receivership under the FDIC. And one of the options of the FDIC is to take the stock in return for bailing them out. So Congress should say, fine, we'll bail you out, but we want the stock. Then we would own some banks. We, the people, would, I mean, if, let's say we had Citibank and J.P. Morgan, that alone would be enough. They're the biggest credit card companies in the world. That alone would be enough to fund the credit of the whole country, you know, the credit cards of everybody. They have branches everywhere, so we would now have little local branches where the government could be responsible for those things that would not make any money for the banks, except for the fact that they're allowed to create money, you know, the taking in of deposits and transferring money by transferring between accounts and stuff. Those very routine things that are very unprofitable. The only reason banks do it is because they get to keep those deposits and count them as reserves against which they get to create all this huge amount of money that they then fund all their other affiliated corporations with. So if we could put in our own system in that way, I think.
Ellen, you probably know Benjamin Franklin also said that work time is the proper standard of price. Maybe you don't.
I didn't know
But
that.
you didn't quote that. But I do want to ask, the title of this session is No More Income Tax. Do you believe that there could be no income tax?
Yes.
I do believe that with monetary reform, proper monetary reform, like all of us are talking about, could tremendously reduce government expenditures, and we could function without the income tax.
Any income tax at all?
Well, I think you would have certain types of taxes that would remain, and you would have the ability to tax that would, that you could use as a regulatory device. But I do, I do believe that the kind of funding that Ellen has talked about, that I've talked about, plus, if you address this gap between prices and purchasing power, and you take away the imperative to fight trade wars, which is what military adventurism is about, fighting trade wars and upholding the value of the dollar as the reserve currency, cut back tremendously on your government expenditures. The best way to get rid of taxes is to cut government expenditures. If along with that you have real monetary reform, yes, I do believe you could cut 3/4 of the cost of government. That's my estimate.
Okay, that's different from saying no. That's saying reduce it dramatically.
Well,
You could do it
but you
like
could
they used
fund
to.
the
Excise
rest
taxes,
by
you have
issue.
duties, you have
There has to
value-added
be a way to
taxes.
support the government.
Yeah, you do have that ability.
But you could fund with the government that you have left. I think you could fund the government we have now by creating money out of nothing, and you still wouldn't be. It still wouldn't.
If you cut out everything out, the waste that goes into supporting a failed monetary system, it's kind of the footnote.
Yeah,
that I
well-
put out.
JW?
I am a fanatic.
No, wait. I'm sorry. I'm calling on the man behind you.
Ellen, you went through the money system, the trace of money, and you never mentioned base money. Do you have a concept of base money within your circulation of money here?
No, I tend to disagree with you on that point. I think that this is money. I mean, this this is what the government calls money. That whole No, I lost it. Anyway, the whole M3 is $12 trillion. That is real money. When you pay your workers and your workers take that money to buy things, we all call that money. We don't refer back to where it came from. Or
That is the economy running. That is the circulation of base money is doing all that. You must have base money first, okay? Then the circulation of that base money is your money supply. And that's
Okay.
what's doing all that.
okay.
And the speed, velocity of that circulation of money, the accounting goes higher and higher and higher of that money supply, okay? Which creates that chart that you just showed there. Take note, the chart started approximately 1967. That's when the banks started their big move on getting away out from under Glass-Steagall, you know, and all the controls put on their, you know, their moves that they always made. And they, one by one, got rid of those laws, and that really started right there about 1967. And you'll take note, that's where M3 starts, okay? So there's this massive increase in circulation of money as they're doing all their ethereal worlds of high finance and doing all this more and more and more and more. And up, you know, so it went up there just steady as can be. Now, of course, they quit putting out M3 3 years ago, they put out
2006,
M3.
yeah.
And, or 4 years ago, maybe it is now. And,
March
that
2006.
chart now should be going down like this, which is the destruction of money. As those values are collapsing, that is the destruction of money, which is why those who run J.P. Morgan also have control of the Federal Reserve, and so they gave them all this money to jack up that thing,
Exactly.
and gave the Fed, which is you and I, those bad paper.
Right.
Okay, but that is what that chart means to me.
But M3 is not going down. M3 is still going up.
Yeah.
M1 is going down. M1 is the money that's available in checking accounts and cash for people like us to spend. That's been going down for 2 years. So the availability of the money within the consuming and production system is declining. M3 is still in the stratosphere.
Or is all this that's going into derivatives, that part of M3? I'll agree with you then, because that's up there, what, 600 and some trillion now, somebody said? Last I read was 580 trillion. It went from 560
Well, that was actually,
trillion
that was trades as
to
opposed to.
580 trillion in 4 months, and somebody else came up with the figure of 640 trillion. Was that you?
The Bank for International Settlements reported in December that it was $681 trillion in trades last year. But so that's actually more than the derivatives themselves.
Yeah, the notional value is only 2% of that figure that was going out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, I'm going to come at it from a different perspective than this, and I have a question. But first, a comment. Watching the presentation from the ecological sustainability point of view, there are those that maintain we are already beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. We've reached a plateau of peak oil production is about ready to head off. You ended your speech talking about we don't have to have scarcity, we can have abundance, and pointing out what needs to be done. And which made me think of that, someone once said to believe in infinite economic growth on a finite planet, you either have to be a madman or an economist. and that you do have scarcity. You know, some economists say it's based on scarcity. There's so-called science, scarcity of only a finite amount of land and what's under it, including the fossil fuels, labor, physical capital. So rather than bridging this gap by government-created money, why not reduce the national income or reduce the gross domestic product down to the national income, reduce consumption of goods and services so we can have an ecologically sustainable world. And there are those that argue that, that the ecological system is a subsystem of the economic system, and it should be the other way around. The economy should be a subsystem of the environment. So that's my question.
Well, there are people who say that it's possible to run the whole world on Tesla-type energy that comes from supposedly it was J.P. Morgan who suppressed cut off Tesla's funding, and that's why we don't have that system now. That we could have 100 years ago, we could have had that. But
Sorry, what system is this?
well, I don't know. Does anyone know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you explain it better than I can?
Oh, no,
I just can't hear the word. Tesla, did you say?
Tesla. Tesla was a man 100 years ago who had a way of taking energy out of the air, but when J.P. Morgan found out that he couldn't run it through wires and charge money for it, then he cut off Tesla's funding.
Just a couple of things to illustrate what Ellen was saying. Around the year 1900, there was a big panic in the economic literature because they calculated there were not going to be enough horses to get us through the 20th century. So that's one thing. The second interesting statistic is I looked at the OMB report on the 2007 federal budget. The ratio of military R&D to civilian energy R&D was 37 to 1. So you can see from there where the brain power is going. It should be figuring all this stuff out. It's going into building more weapons.
Wait, I'm going to call Henry Vaness first. In the back there?
Yeah, I know that the government wastes a lot of money, but my question was when you said cut expenditures, what expenditures are you thinking of? Because I feel like we should have government health care, and the money that we spend for health care is really just like another tax.
Well, let's start with $500 billion in the 09 budget for interest on the national debt. Let's start with Stiglitz's estimate of $3 trillion for the Middle East wars. Those are the two big ones that could be cut. Plus, if you had the kind of income security that we've been talking about in this session, you could roll over two additional enormous federal programs, which are Medicaid and Medicare, and pay those out of an income guarantee rather than federal tax receipts and debt payments. So those are the kind of big expenditures we're talking about. Not for the things we really should do, and government should do a lot of things, a lot more than they are doing in some areas.
There's a hand over there. Go ahead.
Do you think it's a good idea to buy gold and silver?
Yes. I don't think gold and silver works as a currency, but those are my major investments myself.
And
Yeah.
what does Mr. Cook think about gold and silver?
I think as an inflation hedge, that's pretty much up to you. Again, I don't advocate a monetary system based upon gold. If you want to have a redeemable currency, you've got to add silver to it, but even that I don't think is truly necessary. But as an inflation hedge, but then you got to realize those markets are pretty well manipulated as well. But people who try
But
to
it beats
corner on
food. Whatever you wouldn't invest in, you don't want to be in the food ETFs because you're
Let me just
actually
add
driving them
that
crazy.
If you look at the price of gold relative to the consumer price index, it was about 7 to 10 years after the end of the Vietnam War that gold shot up. And we're spending more percentage-wise for the wars in what I've heard is called Western Asia, or the Middle East. And so it may not take 7 years. It may be more like 5 years. And the gold is going to have to shoot up. That's the way I look at it. So you may be getting in too early.
Yeah.
Right now we're at a recent correction. It's hard to give this kind of a thought.
At least it didn't hurt anybody, except maybe some miners in some deep, dark holes. But not like food. If you speculate in food, you're starving it. We're starving the world right now. I just want to make sure.
The reason for trying to oppose an income tax is that income is a very controversial concept. Accountants can completely disagree to what extent profits should be measured and what kind of amortization or depreciation rates or all sorts of other things that are involved in trying to come to a figure that you call income.
Well, we're saying we don't
on the
need
value
income
of
tax, so we
property,
can eliminate all those problems.
you can't have a clear-cut valuation and therefore fairer taxation on property than you can on income.
Okay,
And
but
that's
you don't
why
really need to tax anything
I've
at
been
all.
opposing
I've got
income
a
tax for
whole chapter with
51 years.
figures in it demonstrating that you could do it without taxing anything. Okay.
Most of the people who I've met this weekend think that the collapse is actually part of the banker's plan.
Yeah.
Now, based on my last question, it sounds to me like you don't agree, that you think they're losing control and they would not want this to happen. But have you entertained the notion that that is actually part of their plan and that they're 5 steps beyond the collapse in terms of preserving wealth and playing their game of risk with this globe? Talk about that. Do you think it is part of the plan? They want it to collapse?
I think their plan would be to impose a police state when it does collapse. But the reason it's collapsing and must collapse is that you can only keep a Ponzi scheme up so long, and there's no way they can stop this. Some people estimate it's a quadrillion that derivatives are now up to. I mean, there's just no way. What they've done so far is create one bubble after another.
They're going to milk it, you think? They're going to milk it as long as they can.
Yeah, exactly.
But they are preparing for post-collapse.
Yeah, but I think, well, if you want to get conspiratorial, there was a Bilderberger meeting in the, I think it was in the 60s, and there was a man named Ball who talked about the world company, and this was the goal, to have the world company where they would buy up everything by mergers and acquisitions. And you know that's what they do all the time. Well, where do they get the money for these mergers and acquisitions? This is the money that the banks created on nothing and lend to themselves, essentially, buy up everything. And so in the end, I mean, it's just what Amschel Rothschild said a couple hundred years ago, that once they, if they control the money, if they can buy up everything, then it doesn't matter what governments do. That the government will be irrelevant. They can let us vote and so forth.
The collapse won't matter either. If they're prepared
right, if they own everything.
So what do you see, if you subscribe to that notion that they're preparing for it, what do you see as the solution? I mean, you're talking about thwarting the collapse and creating an entirely different system, but we all know they're not going to just
well,
so what do we
no.
do?
Well, the reason I think we could have the leverage to get them to get Congress to do something is that every single subprime borrower has a good defense to foreclosure, because the banks only made those subprime loans because they had absolutely no intention of keeping them. They are now able to bundle them up into securities and chop them up into tranches and sell them off to investors. But they've been sold to so many investors and chopped up so much, and the little pieces are traded around, that nobody knows who owns what. So so there are 2 major lawsuits from last fall, federal court saying that you can't foreclose without. I mean, it's always has been a requirement, but anyway, there are these actual judgments. The major one was by Judge Boyko in Ohio, saying the Deutsche Bank could not foreclose on 13 mortgages that it was trying to foreclose on behalf of mortgage-backed securities holders because they didn't have the paper. They didn't have the. In fact, I have a little.
You mean they literally don't have the paper?
They don't. They don't have the promissory note. They have to either have the promissory note or a recorded assignment, and they don't have that on any of these cases. There's a woman named April Charney who does this sort of thing in Florida, and she's done many of these cases, and so I've been in email contact with her, and she says they always say the note's lost. They always say that because they don't have the paperwork. So if we can mobilize all, or a lot of subprime people who they usually just let their homes go by default because they don't know that they have this defense. So I was thinking we could form some sort of union or lobby where we could prepare a packet of pleadings so people could just file these defenses. If nothing else, it would definitely slow up the banks in foreclosing. Then, on top of that, there are all those people that are upside down in their mortgages that owe more than the house is worth. They have no reason not to walk out on those mortgages except pride and maybe worry about their credit. But if you mobilized a lot of people, so everybody was doing it together or threatening to do it together, we could bring down the banks ourselves. So with that, at least we could go to Congress and say, this is our union, and this is the power we have, and this is what we're prepared to do unless we get some relief with these banks. We want to see the books. We want to see if they're solvent. If they're not, they should go into receivership, et cetera.
Are any congressmen or senators working on this issue right now? Is anyone brave enough to take on the banks?
Dennis Kucinich, of course, has, but But not really. I mean, when he was running for president, he still barely mentioned it because you just can't bring that stuff up. And I mean, that's the way the system works. But that's why we need some sort of clout other than just public protests. We need the ability to actually cripple the banks, which I think we could.
If here's one more question real quick. If we crippled the income tax system itself, would that ultimately take the banks down, or just the government, or both? How do you see that playing? I mean, there's a big anti-tax movement that's gaining steam.
Yeah. My own feeling is I don't think we want to violate any laws. I mean, there is such a law, whether or not it's constitutional. We could do it totally legally. In other words, the law is on our side. The banks are the ones who are acting illegally. And so if we could just expose that and show homeowners or debtors in general, the credit card victims also have good defenses. There are many people being defrauded by banks who have good defenses. If we could just...
I just got a question on that because I'm going through that experience recently. I mean, doesn't that kind of come up under usury laws? That there's these bank notes going back and forth that nobody has track of? Because from personal experience, I wonder about that because I was told that, since you have an unwritten loan, it doesn't matter where it went, you lose it.
I think they've eliminated the usury laws. That's why they're up to like 40% or something.
But it seemed like, because I was told that they needed interest rates, time loans, amounts, and all kinds of other things they need to have in there. Otherwise, it doesn't apply. So, and now if they acknowledge these notes went to somebody else and they don't know who it went to, now they're gone. So
well, that's what I don't actually know those particular defenses, but you do see people who say they can represent that sort of case, and they seem to be having success. So that's what I'm thinking. If we got together and told people what their rights were, then so that we had a united force that we could mount against the banks. As one little guy, you're liable to lose in court because the judge will just say, well, I've never heard of that. But if a lot of people did it and real lawyers were defending them, that we could be a significant force. Yeah.
If we had this coalition of people with problem mortgages and debts, then who would one go to in Congress, and what exactly would one ask for? I mean, the House Banking Committee, but more importantly, what exactly would we say?
I don't know. I suppose the Banking and Currency Committee.
Banking and Currency.
Mm-hmm. But I would ask for an audit of the banks.
Uh-huh.
It's almost certain that J.P. Morgan acted illegally in the Bear Stearns thing, and they did it specifically, or so I've written because I read, that they are bankrupt. J.P. Morgan was bankrupt, and they needed that. They got a $50 billion loan, 2 loans from the U.S. Federal Reserve, which is us ultimately, because we're the ones that bear the cost of inflation.
Right.
In order to bail out Bear Stearns, which actually didn't need to be bailed out until their stock was decimated by naked short sales, which are themselves illegal. So, and there's pretty good evidence for that.
Wholesale at 2 cents on the dollar.
Yeah, $2 a share it went from $156 a share to $2 a share. So the shareholders got wiped out, and these were 30% were the employees of Bear Stearns.
So now it's a hero.
Yeah, and J.P. Morgan is supposed to be the big savior that saved him, and actually J.P. Morgan was the one that made off with the money. There was nothing for the shareholders. Yeah.
You were asked earlier if the banks are doing this on purpose, and it triggered a memory that Gertrude Coogan wrote a book in 1935 called The Money Creators, in which she said this is exactly what the bankers do. They extend credit, a bunch of people borrow, and then they collapse that by calling in loans or whatever, buy the collateral at a low price, and then relend it. Mm-hmm. It's like this breathing phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
So when you said, are they doing it on purpose? Well, Gertrude Coogan would say, yes, they do it all the time.
That's what Thomas Jefferson said.
And I kind of agree that there's some people in control, but we get into this discussion all the time that I think that there's some people that control parts of the market, but they can't control the whole complete picture. But I just wanted, you can turn that slide back on. I just want to go back to a more probably basic question that I'm having trouble understanding. It was your last one. And one of the basic things that, you know, to say that you can't have, or capitalists don't want full employment because that's going to cause inflation. You want people that are unemployed, so you have always this pool of people to bank against to get inflation to go, the rates to go back down again. And now we're entering a time when there's all these groups, all these cycles are happening at the same time, and we're going to have these huge unemployment rates. But going to the question about when you say potential GDP, I mean, how do you say that there won't be inflationary pressures if everybody's unemployed and he can go, well, I can go work for this other guy now. I mean, it seems like there would be a natural instinct that if I'm at 100% employment, what would prevent the employees for asking more and more money and then causing inflation to happen that way?
That's an inflationary factor, and that was what was happening in the 60s, or actually coming out of the 50s. There was a lot of inflationary pressure. That's why John Kennedy was trying to talk to both sides, labor and management, to keep prices under control, and that's one reason Nixon instituted wage and price controls. But I think what we were saying in our monetary reform panel yesterday, if we had a guaranteed income in a national dividend, something like that, to feed in purchasing power at the consumer level, it would take a lot of the pressure off of wage inflation. I found a quote from Jefferson that I mentioned to Bob. I have it in my computer. Jefferson wrote this in 1802 in a letter to his Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and returned to the people to whom it properly belongs.
Where is that from? I mean, where could I look it up?
This is a letter from President Thomas Jefferson to Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin.
And it's on your website?
In 1802.
Is it on your website?
It's going to be in my book.
Oh, okay.
but you can find that quote. I mean, there's places that have Jefferson quotes.
Okay.
If you enter it in, if
As
you
I
Google it,
pointed
you'll
out,
find it.
they speed up the inflation by getting us into war.
That's right.
And so that's how wars fit into the cycle that Jefferson was describing.
That's exactly right.
It's not moving along fast enough. They find a war to get us into it. Spend more money, which then inflates what we do because we can't pay it at the time, so we borrow it.
That's how, what we were talking earlier today, that's how the Federal Reserve destroyed the greenbacks and the metallic currency after World War I.
Yes.
It was through this massive inflation.
This is kind of going back further in history for a complete cycle. Was it like the early 1600s when the Medicis controlled the foreign banking system? Has anybody done a...
What was that?
When the
Medicis.
Yeah, the
Medicis.
Medicis, sorry. They controlled the banking system in Florence, and they had a great influence with all the trades coming out of China and the new routes, and with the spices, they controlled that, and I don't know what year, that eventually that collapsed. And is there been a kind of analysis about that time period to what's happening?
The Medicis
and I'm not sure
actually,
which banking model they had.
The Medicis who ruled Florence actually have a reputation of being probably the most responsible bankers in history, because they did not inflate the currency. They were very responsible with who they lent to. Their terms of lending were very generous. They were not regarded as predators through rates of interest. And it was essentially the Medicis who created the Italian Renaissance from their banking house, because they used the profits to support people like Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci. I mean, they're viewed as kind of the heroes of Renaissance economic history, versus the Genoese, who were viewed as the villains of Italy because of their tremendous usury and Also, the bankers of Venice, who perfected modern accounting and bookkeeping, were viewed as very predatory lenders whose system eventually ended up in Northern Europe and morphed over time into the Bank of England. So it just shows you that credit is a two-edged sword. You know, it's not. No one should ever say that lending and credit is bad. It depends on how it's used, for what purpose. Is it used responsibly? Is it used in the public interest? Or is it used for private profit to the detriment of the community? And I think we're seeing the latter just taking off. We're seeing the wrong use of banking, the wrong use of credit today, destroying the world economy.
Well, I just feel like there has to be, again, a spiritual component to this to get people to come together. Because education...
Or real depression. People certainly have organized in the 30s, for instance. There was a huge monetary reform movement in the 30s. When people are really starving, they do take action.